Hello, and this video is going to talk about sustainability through the lens of indigenous peoples. And the reading for this idea comes from Jeanette Armstrong, who is of the Silk people. And the Silk people have traditionally lived in what is north central Washington state and Canada above that, right? But now they're mostly in Canada. And Armstrong is well known as a writer and an activist. And she was one of the first successful female indigenous writers from that region before she eventually went and got advanced degrees and now is a consultant on in the environment and Native American traditions and things like that across Canada mainly, right? But this transcript you're looking at, which is from originally from an interview, deals a lot with her people's culture perspective, but particularly about sustainability. So we're going to jump right into that, right? And but before we do that, we got to talk a little bit about the traditional European view, which informs the American view, right? I wouldn't even say traditional, but we'll say contemporary, right? That modern, that informs the American view as well about what the proper relationship between a human and nature is, right? So it goes back to the idea that in a lot of European cultures, nature was viewed as, especially as Christianity began to rise, nature began to be viewed as a kind of dangerous place, right? Still part of God's creation, but something that our influence was supposed to tame. We use the word wild in English to describe it, the wilderness. And the feeling of the wilderness is that it's uncivilized, it's untamed, it's kind of purely natural. It's the thing that humans are not in a certain sense, right? Our human civilization is not what the wilderness is, but we bring our civilization to it, right? And so the idea is that that was part of God's plan for us was that nature was God's creation and it's fine, but its goodness, its improvement comes when we shape it to our will, which looks like building farms and houses and things like that, right? And that perspective kind of grew in a couple of ways. One, as the church grew in power after the fall of the Roman Empire, there began to be a skepticism, a fear of a lot of traditional European cultural practices and their relationships to nature. People viewed it as worshiping nature, or some of the roots and information that a lot of women had was viewed as witchcraft. So many of them were killed during the witch trials, and that knowledge either subsumed into contemporary medical practice of the time or destroyed and forgotten, right? And another thing that helped with this change was the emergence of capitalism and industrialism, which really made nature to be about productivity. Right? There's a phenomenon called the enclosure of the commons, which was the elimination of a lot of common space. So under feudalism, the idea is that the king owned all the land, but then peasants worked on the land, and then those a certain amount of peasants, let's say 10, just to make it simple, they were kind of protected by one knight. And then those 10 knights, so each having 10 peasants underneath them, they worked under one duke, right? And eventually it goes up to the king. And so each of them gave a percentage. So one peasant, let's say he gave 10% of his yield to the knight. So each of the 10 peasants gave 10% of their yield to the knight. So that was the knight's share. And then that knight had to give 10% of that to the duke. So each of the 10 knights gave what they got to the duke, and then all the dukes gave 10% to the king, and that's how wealth was kind of circulated, right? But with the emergence of industrialization, a new idea emerged where it's like, you don't have to do that. In fact, 10 peasants working land, because they got to give to their family and they got to do all these things, that's way less efficient than just converting as much of that land as possible to one crop that you can sell all over the world, right? And the forest that used to be the kings used to have to hunt or dukes and all those things, peasants used to be able to forage in them. They used to be able to go get mushrooms and hunt deer and other things like that. Now there were certain restrictions on when they could do that, but They were allowed to go and get some fish. They were allowed to, it varied by what the king or the duke or the knight that owned that area allowed them to do, but they were able to harvest and have a relationship with the land in that way. But as industrialization developed, and now the goods that that land could produce could go anywhere over the world, monoculture, monocropping, and singular use land became way more important. And I don't want a bunch of peasants coming through this. I want to use every single tree to for lumber to build ships to travel around the world and whatnot. So a lot of peasants got forced off their land or forced away from sustaining themselves. And so many of them had to move to cities, or some of them went to the New World right away, the American continents, or some went later after they didn't like the city very much, right? But that was something that changed the relationship to land. Now, another important part, so we have two so far, right? One is the rise of Christianity and its changing relationship to nature as not supposed to be a site of worship, as meant to be tamed, and God's grace being brought by productivity and farms in a certain kind of way, right? The second one was the emergence of industrialization and capitalism, which said that no, nature is primarily a resource we can extract value from, and that value should be mapped on a global scale. So the sustainability of the people living on it isn't as important as the profit that we can be making on a larger scale. And the peasants can have a perfectly good life helping turn the land into products, helping build ships, helping make different trinkets or other things that we can convert our resources into, right? Helping turn tea that we get from India and putting it into tea bags, right? Or containers that can be boiled or things like that, right? Now, the third one is liberalism in a certain sense, right? Remember we talked about John Locke? Very little bit we talked about John Locke, right? With the notion of tabula rasa. But John Locke was one of the most important liberal philosophers of all time. He had the biggest influence on the United States' political philosophy, right? What Thomas Jefferson said that life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, that's the purpose of what every individual person is entitled to, that comes from John Locke. But John Locke said life, liberty, and property were things that all people were entitled to, which was a revolutionary idea at the time, right? The idea that every person, well, in that case, every man, should have property was pretty astounding because most people didn't own property. The king, like I said, in the feudalism, the king owned everything. And if you got anything, it was because it was because of your title. You were a duke or a knight. That's where the term entitlement comes from, right? It's by virtue of your title. You don't really own it per se, but it comes by virtue of your title, right? But Locke said, no, everyone should have property because where does ownership of land come from? Like, how can you own the land then, right? Because the king's mandate to own everything came from God, right? God basically elected the king, kind of like, because God controls everything. The king has the mandate from God, and therefore the king owns everything. But if the king doesn't own everything, then how does anyone justify owning wilderness, this wild thing that's, prior, not dependent on human activity? Well, Locke said that it's labor, that when you work the land, your consciousness, your will kind of goes into the land. And if you work it and shape it, then it becomes yours. If you cut down trees and build a house there, you clear it away, you plant a farm there, all that kind of stuff like that, that's how land can belong to anybody. Because it's not some mandate from the king, it's our labor that shapes the land and makes it belong to us, right? So that's another change with the idea that if you work the land, it then belongs to you. It's your property, and every individual can have that. Now, all three of those ideas inform a lot of modern environmental perspectives, for better or for worse. And all three are different than how Armstrong is viewing it as a Sikh person, right? So, what's one of the major differences, right? So, one is that for the Sikh people, there's no notion that humans are separate from nature. We don't bring something that allows, like a will, that allows us to own it. It's not that God created for us to kind of dominate or to shape by our will, but we're fundamentally a part of nature. And more important, we're crucial to nature being successful. There's the difference, right? One of the tensions that's in the modern environmental movement and related to sustainability is that what does it mean to sustain nature? Now, because of this legacy of the idea of wilderness being untamed, right? Now, prior to that, it's like you need to work it and cut it down and shape it and become productive with it. But then people start saying, no, no, we need to preserve nature. We need to conserve it, right? Preserve it and conserve it, conservation. But that meant that it should be untouched, right? That a lot of these wilderness parks like Yosemite and Yellowstone and things like that come from this idea that nature to be protected needs minimal human interaction. Humans are meant to be on the outside. We can enjoy it. We can go into nature, but we leave. We don't leave trash. We don't do a whole lot. We don't get too integrated in it, right? And generally, nature kind of does its own thing and we kind of respect it, right? So from the European perspective, which informs the American perspective, it's either we're actively working this wilderness or we're letting the wilderness just be wild, right? Civilization's kind of separate from nature. But Armstrong says, no, for us, we're deeply embedded in nature. It's our job to shape it. She says you should understand our relationship to our land as like a giant garden. Like she says, anthropologists said that we're migratory, that we kind of move from one area to another. We don't have a stable home. That's not really true. We have our winter homes, but our territory was large. So each season we spent time in different places where it was appropriate to help balance out the flow of animals and plants and cultivate and harvest and shape things, right? And so it's our job to help the land grow. It's our job to help the land flourish. If we're not there, the land doesn't flourish as much as it's supposed to. So it's a very different idea, right? There's not this notion of wilderness over here, civilization over here. Instead, civilization and the land and nature are infused together, right? I keep going back to this notion of garden, right? For her, the ideal for her people is like an enlightened gardener, someone who understands the balance and flow of all the things around them. And so when a lot of European people came to the Americas, they were impressed by the bounty of what they saw in a lot of places. Like in California, the Spaniards were so impressed by how bountiful the land was. In lots of areas, they were shocked by how bountiful the land was. And because of their perspective on what nature was, they understood it as wow, this land is wilderness, it's untapped, and it's so fruitful and productive. And these Native American people don't do anything, they don't work the land, they just roam around and collect and forage. They don't even make this to be as productive as it could be. And this goes back to how, when we talk about Rousseau, how he talked about indigenous people, and some of the debates about whether or not indigenous people are human or not, was one of the things was they're primitive because they don't build farms in the same way we do. They don't build buildings and villages in the same way that we do. And they have all this bounty and they don't use it. What they didn't know was that part of it is that for indigenous people, you farm the forest. You help the forest grow. You don't knock it down or change it a whole lot. You just help it be more productive than it would have been without you. So one of the key ideas for sustainability is that sustainability involves deep human interaction with nature, that humans are meant to be interwoven with nature. Wilderness is not the same concept, right? Obviously, it's not like they're befriending every animal and there's never threats or problems, but it's understood that your responsibility is to be integrated into nature, into the land, that you need to be a part of it. And she said later in the interview that there's a lot of birds and other species that are disappearing and dying, and the land is largely untouched, right? So she says she thinks it's part of it's because we're not out there anymore working it. And so I say all this because there's a tension between a lot of indigenous people and perfectly well-minded and people who are from the American culture about what sustainability means and how humans should be related to nature. Right? A lot of indigenous people say, "Hey, we need to take responsibility for the land. We need to be out there integrated into it." Whereas a lot of Americans say, "No, we need to keep it untouched as possible." The more untouched it is, the better it is. Yeah, there's got to be some forest rangers, some scientists going around, that are regularly working there. But generally, people shouldn't be living in Yosemite, right? People can camp there, but you clean up everything, and it should basically be like what we say, leave it as it was when you got there, right? Whereas the indigenous perspective, like, no, you should probably have some communities living in Yellowstone, living in the redwoods, who know how to take care of it, who know how to build a relationship with it and build with it, right? That's where you see the difference. And that's the tension, because there are a lot of indigenous people who feel like we should be doing that. And the Americans are like, no, we should not, right? So that's one important part of sustainability. Like, what are humans' proper role towards nature, right? And this is where the term, as she says, often when she talks about animals or plants, she calls them, a couple of times she calls them relatives. So the idea is that the human is not so distinct. Certain animals, and not all the same for every community, but certain animals are understood as your relative. Certain plants or trees are understood as your relatives, as your kin. You take care of them just as you would other family members, right? I'll give another example. This one from much further south in the Andes Mountains in South America. I have a dear friend who's of the Kamsa people in Colombia, and he's a philosopher, and he's done some work to talk to different indigenous groups about their perspectives on nature and things like that. And for the Andes people, Mother Nature is not a metaphor. Like in the US, we say, oh, we have to protect Mother Earth and that stuff. It really just means, it's just a symbol, meaning like the kind of generative, fruitful resources we get from nature, and that we should care for that and things like that, right? But for the Andes people, it's real. You interact with nature as if it's your mom, and you build a relationship with nature, and you understand ways that nature cares for you, and you care for her. So it's not a metaphor; it's a literal way you're supposed to see and interact with nature, as if as it's your mom. In the same way you treat your mom, that's how you treat nature. The same way you might be upset if someone mistreats your mom, that's how you feel if someone's mistreating nature, right? Not all indigenous people believe that, but that's just an example of one that's like, you are literally nature's child. And that means that you're supposed to be out interacting. Just like your mom. Imagine if stop seeing your mom or your grandma or your aunt, right? And whoever people who care for you the most, like, you stop visiting with them because you're like, oh, I'm gonna leave you on your own. You don't need my help. You don't need me. I'm really grateful that you took care of me, and I'm going to pay. I'm going to pay $1,500 a month to make sure that you get some extra care in your life. But I'm not going to visit you ever because I don't want to disturb you, right? That person will be like, "What? That's crazy." Like, I want you to be here. I want you to be with me. There's something valuable about you being in the house. Yeah, you might make a mess, right? Sometimes, or yeah, I might have to do some other things, or yeah, whatever, but there's something valuable about you being here. So that's a way to understood, is that humans have, by our nature, have an capacity to connect with other life forms, and that we can help nature grow and develop. That our presence with nature is incredibly important. Like, that's our role, that's our purpose, is to make nature flourish and to show gratitude for life. We're not meant to be separate. Now, the second aspect about sustainability that's very important is that sustainability is more than just a environmental value, it's a cultural value. So for instance, Armstrong says that poverty, she's like, having a lot of poverty for her traditional perspective, it's unsustainable. It's not sustainability. Sustainability is ensuring that everything flourishes for as long as it possibly can, right? Everything can does the best that it can for as long as it can, right? That's kind of sustainability. And so I want you to think about, how much does American culture, or the culture of the country you come from, care about genuine sustainability as a cultural value, not just an environmental value, as in stopping the exploitation of nature, right? She says that it's hard to translate the term sustainability into her language. She says in our language, the way our attitude towards sustainability is she says it sounds like how to continue to abuse the land without destroying it, how to keep exploiting it without destroying it. So that seems to be like what people are trying to talk about when they mention sustainability in English, right? But I said, but for us, it's a much deeper value. The first part being, as I said, that it's a statement that humans have an integral purpose with nature. But the second part is that it's a deeper cultural commitment to the well-being of others, other life forms, other people. So to that end, think about relationships, right? I would say that our culture, there's a lot of cultures in the world that are not sustainable in relationships. They don't really care. Think about how long someone's going to be friends. We don't make a lot of space for people to have meaningful relationships and bonds that they can build with for their whole life. A lot of people, they meet their friends in high school and college, and if they're lucky if they keep as many of those as they can. But if they lose them, it's kind of hard to get them back. I know lots of people now talk about how hard it is to make friends in your 30s and 40s because you don't have time. How do you not have time? I don't mean that in a judgmental way. I mean that in a sense that we don't have time because our culture doesn't value that. It takes time to sustain a relationship. It takes time to make sure people get what they need and that they're cared for. It takes time to help bonds grow. And our culture doesn't, and not just ours, lots of cultures don't want to devote time to that because that time is spent to be productive, to work in a certain kind of way, right? And so that's where Armstrong is understanding is that like it seems like their sustainability doesn't mean we don't want to destroy this stuff because it's going to hurt us, but there's something about the genuine care for others, the genuine care for life itself that's not really in how people are talking about sustainability. For us, sustainability would mean like a complete cultural sustainability, right? And she takes a step further and she said it also literally would mean living off the land, really depending on the land, not buying your stuff from somewhere else far away. She said try living a whole year without buying anything, then you'll kind of understand what sustainability means for us. But also, in addition to that, there's this cultural value, right? Which is how much do we respect life? How much do we care for life? And how much do we want to just use it for what we can get out of it? So I want you to think about like what would it mean for us to have more sustainable friendships or relationships? Do you think that this notion is our culture, social life sustainable? Is our romantic life patterns sustainable? Not just is our relationship to the environment sustainable, but is our cultural patterns sustainable? Are people really growing through these things that we're establishing, right? Is social media and its relationships that relationship it creates between us, is it sustainable in the sense that it helps people grow to be better than they were if it wasn't there? It's just an open question. It's just more that we don't often think about it that way. And Armstrong's inviting us to think about it that way. So that's the sustainability piece. Now, another part, there's a lot as the article is very rich, right? But there's another part in which she talks about how her people kind of solve problems. And it's a very interesting strategy, but it involves an understanding of different people's different capacities. It's like an axis, right? And on the axis, there's elderly and young people. And she says elderly people, this is how their notion of sustainability plays out practically in terms of their social philosophy. The elders, she says they tend to be conservative. They value tradition. They respect what's been known, right? And they understand that if you move too far away from tradition too fast, the communal thread falls apart. But then there's also young people. And young people, they want to change things. They want to bring new ideas, new perspectives. And there's a value for both. right? If there's too much, if the elders have too much power, culture gets stagnant, right? The community doesn't grow because the elders don't want to change. There could be serious problems that aren't dealt with because people don't want to change their methods to a new situation. And if the young people have too much power or too much influence, the community starts to kind of fray a bit. People forget about the traditions. People lose their sense of identity. People neglect things that maybe were already solved, right? Because maybe there's an issue we have now, but people kind of already figured it out a while ago. We just need to consult and figure it out. So maybe you can make us have to call reinventing the wheel, right? Because you don't know what already exists. But those perspectives are supposed to be in tension, right? There's a balance that's supposed to be struck. Now, the other pole is between male and female, right? Which she says is not what people talk about gender and sexuality. She says it's not really that. They're more like archetypes or energies. And particularly the best way to describe it, and remember, these are translations from a different language. So some of the connotations or feelings that come from how we use those words or what we mean by those words is not the same, right? So it's mothers and fathers, right? So mothers, she describes as people who are nurturing, who care about people's feelings, who really are the real community builders, who know that people need to feel like they belong, who pay a lot of attention to feelings, right? And she's very important to note that it's not necessarily about gender or sexuality. So she's a man can be in the mother category. eh, it's not really it's more about but those energies are more described through those terms, right? And is associated with mothers. It's mothers are more naturally like that, right? But males or fathers can be in that camp too. The other one is fathers. And fathers are the ones who understand the resource of the community. They know how to change things to get things done. They know how to solve a problem and act in a decisive manner, right? Now, both of these poles are necessary, right? She says if the mothering side is too strong, it's a conservative force, once again, that it can be really hard to get things done if you have to wait for everyone to feel like they matter. You have to address how everyone feels about everything. Oftentimes, they don't want to let there be a lot of changes because it's going to disrupt the sense of harmony between how people feel, right? If you introduce something new, it causes a lot of discord. So oftentimes, they want to slow things down, which is not a bad thing. But it's more of a slowing force. And she says fathers. They she says and she says too much of that can be a bad thing. So she says in American society, there's not enough of it, right? But the father also has problems in that sometimes they can act without caring for how people feel, and they can disrupt a sense of community, right? That they can make people feel alienated. They can make people feel like they don't belong. We can miss out on knowledge because people don't feel like they're heard. People aren't feel seen. People don't feel like they're involved in the process. So you can build the thing you need to build or do the thing you need to do and alienate a lot of people. Create enmity between people for years because of how you dealt with something. Just because you didn't help people process how they felt about what you were trying to do. So it can cause a lot of destruction to community and the emotional well-being of people if you're just trying to move and act and go. And so this ties to sustainability because this is how, for them, they make decisions. They try to find a harmony or consensus, a balance between these different sides. And as you can imagine, as she says, the fathers often tend to gravitate towards young people, and the mothers tend to gravitate towards elders because they both kind of understand that even though they have their differences, they both kind of understand a similar perspective. So they're kind of counterbalances, counterweights, right? And but sometimes there'll be flips and things like that, right, for different reasons. But the whole goal is that a decision is made by trying to gain consensus, to try to bring everybody's perspective together. And that might take some time, but it's worth it. It's not that everyone agrees, because that would be impossible, right? But that everyone is understood. Everyone understands what's at stake. Everyone's listened to. Everyone's heard. And this also ties to a connection she makes between thought and feeling, that feelings and thoughts belong together. It's not just about logic and action. It's not just about feeling and how people feel connect, what the people feel connected to, what they value, but to create a proper balance between them. It's a way of bringing having the community think through problems together. Instead, in our contemporary culture, we see particular groups making all these decisions and other people being blocked from decisions, and then there's resentment and anger and all these tensions that we're dealing with now, which for Armstrong is unsustainable. It's hard to sustain the community when whole groups of people don't feel like they had a full contribution to what's being done around them, or feel like they've lost their contribution. So I want you to think more about for the end of this in terms of what do you think about sustainability culturally? What do you think is the proper role between a human and nature? Are we fundamentally a part of nature, or are we separate in some kind of way, or something in between? But I want you to reflect more on these questions, and I hope that this indigenous perspective has clarified perhaps maybe some things going wrong in different places around the world, and perhaps we can move towards we can take what we can to learn more about a kind of harmonious mode of living. Until next time.